Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 39, The Darkie, Part 2. If you haven't already, please go back and listen to Part 1 before commencing Part 2, so you have an understanding of the beginning of his life and also his earlier exploits as one of Australia's bushrangers. John Maguire and Ben Hall then commenced a new venture, a cattle station called Sandy Creek. Through Hall and Maguire, Gardiner fell for the beautiful Catherine, or Kitty as she was known, Brown, their sister-in-law. She was a vivacious slim blonde, 5'3" tall, 18, and living with her husband John Brown, a quiet, easygoing, hard-working stockman, residing in a hut a short distance from the Wego Station homestead and adjacent to the Sandy Creek station. Kitty fell head over heels for Gardiner, throwing all caution to the wind, and abandoned her husband. Gardiner was 14 years older than Catherine, and Catherine had married John Brown when she was only 16. To assist in the apprehension of Gardiner, in 1861 or early 1862, the New South Wales Police created a detailed map of Gardiner's known routes and haunts covering an area of 80 miles, and they listed those people long suspected of harbouring the bushranger. Over the next 18 months, to the residents of Burrangong and surrounding districts, Gardiner was hailed King of the Road. However, amongst all the action, Gardiner was never far from the arms of Kitty Brown. There are even tales of Kitty's participation in hold-ups of travellers disguised in men's clothing. For Gardiner, however, his entourage ebbed and flowed amongst the district's undesirables as they hunted for travellers and eased them of their monetary and personal possessions. As well as Kitty, John Walsh Jr., also known as the Warrigal, Kitty's younger brother, was to fall under Gardiner's spell. John Walsh was 14, and he would often be noticed in Gardiner's company, holding his horse or tending his needs while robbery took place. At a very young age, the Warrigal could ride like the wind and take jumps that would make any ordinary person quiver in fright. The boy knew no fear. Sadly, the Warrigal's relationship with Gardiner would cost him his life at 16 in March 1863, following his arrest at his sister Kitty's home in August 1862, and he was incarcerated, covering many months at the primitive Forbes lockup. John Walsh died of typhus fever in the jail. The coolness and ease demonstrated by Christie, whose widespread reputation had morphed him into Frank Gardiner, conducted his robberies with a certain flair and aplomb, which became his trademark. Gardiner's politeness enhanced his reputation when dealing with the women faced with a revolver at their breast. Gardiner was calm and often humorous. The police, however, were of no concern to Frank Gardiner. In a complete insult to civilised standards, Gardiner always outpaced them, or at times with unnerving audacity, casually confronted and returned fire whenever cornered, or manoeuvred to effect his escape while being mounted on the best of the best thoroughbreds. Nevertheless, recruits such as John Gilbert, John Davis, Jack O'Malley and Pat McGuinness and others all gravitated to the Darkie, reputedly nicknamed by his muscular athletic build and dark-complexioned handsome looks, as well as the love of the dark arts, that is, fortune-telling. One of the most successful and most rewarding robberies for the bushranger was the bailing up of two storekeepers on the 10th of March 1862. After months of small takings, Gardiner had hit pay dirt. Gardiner's victims were Alfred Horsington and his wife Sophia and Henry Hewitt. The businessmen were stopped near Big Wombat. Alfred Horsington knew Gardiner by sight. Alfred had been incapacitated by a broken leg and was riding in a spring cart with his wife. The bushrangers acquired 253 ounces of gold and £145 in notes, and from Henry Hewitt they acquired 189 ounces of gold and £172 in money. The value of the robbery in today's terms was $783,000 worth of gold and cash. After the lucrative Horsington and Hewitt transaction, Gardiner allowed the travellers to proceed on their journey without bodily injury. However, a gun was discharged when Horsington appeared to reach for something in the cart, and it was fired by McGuinness. It was said that the bullet had passed between Mrs. Horsington and her husband. Gardiner stuck up and robbed 2 drays of provisions, spirits and winter clothing on the 12th of April. Gardiner went to Mr. Chisholm's station at Bland and stole a horse on the 17th, and a telegram from Forbes says sticking up is still the order of the day between here and Lambing Flat. On the 20th, Gardiner stuck up about 25 men on the Lachlan Road a few days ago and several drays. On the 23rd, Gardiner and 4 armed men dashed in front of Greig's coach on the road from Lachlan to Barangong and turned into the bush again. On the same day, they stuck up and robbed a dray belonging to Moses and Son, and the other day they stuck up and robbed Mr. Greig's dray on the Lachlan Road. Following the robbery, Gardiner swiftly resurfaced at the Prings farm near Lambing Flat, accompanied by his notorious companions, O'Malley, Gilbert, Ben Hall and Davis. Gardiner immediately made himself at home. In an audacious display of bravenness, he requested refreshments and demanded weapons. So assured was he that Gardiner even requested one of the terrified occupants to play the piano, turning the high-stakes robbery into a bizarre social gathering. They partook in some brandy and water before Gardiner and his gang, armed with Pring's firearms, left as abruptly as they arrived. Emerging as the unchallenged leader, Frank Gardiner surrounded himself with fear and daring accomplices. On the 10th of April 1862, Davis and Gardiner's partnership came to an abrupt end. Police officers, Lyons, Kennedy and Sanderson, escorting prisoners, alighted from a coach outside Brewer's Shanty, 25 miles from Lambing Flat. Here they chanced upon Davis, McGuinness and Connolly. Observing the 3 bushrangers suspiciously, the police challenged them to stand. Davis, undeterred, withdrew his revolver and opened fire. Davis would be shot several times and taken. Lyons had a finger shot off. For Davis, he received the sentence of death, but it was commuted to life. He did 3 years in irons, but on account of his health failing and being a cripple from bullet wounds, the irons which cut into his legs were knocked off. He obtained his freedom after serving 15 years in January 1877 and died in agony, an emaciated lunatic. The 2 associates of Gardiner, Paddy Connolly and John McGuinness, who were with Davis at the commencement of the gunfight at Brewer's Shanty, had bolted from the field of combat in an act of cowardice. For fleeing, McGuinness would pay a high price and be shot dead, reportedly on Gardiner's orders. Another report has McGuinness shot dead for interfering with an Aboriginal woman. Paddy Connolly would be stripped of everything by the Darkie, beaten with a whip and escaped with an inch of his life and stripped of his money. The capture of John Davis was indeed a major setback for Frank Gardiner. Davis was not just another member of the gang, he was a valuable first lieutenant, and his loss left a significant void in Gardiner's band. Davis was renowned for his bravery, wit and agility and fine horsemanship. But Gardiner, ever the strategist, promptly replaced Davis with John Gilbert. Gilbert, much like Davis, was a brave and daring individual, an expert horseman, and most importantly, unwaveringly loyal. The gang, despite the setback, adapted and persevered, embodying the chaotic and resilient spirit of the bushranging era. There's a report that says at Mr. Croker's station, one of the bushrangers played the concertina and sang Ever of Thee to the host. On the person of the prisoner was found a considerable sum of money, a bank chequebook, a revolver, a compass, and the horse on which he was mounted was captured. Gardiner now had his eyes clapped on a far bigger prize. He was aware of the route the gold escort took from the Arulan diggings through to Orange and decided to rob it as it took the gold from the diggings to the town at a place called Eugowra Rocks. He recruited John Bow, Alex Fordyce, Henry Manns, Johnny Gilbert, Dan Charters, Ben Hall, John O'Malley and Charles Darcy to help him make the score. On the 15th of June 1862, Gardiner launched his attack. As the coach rounded a bend, the sudden appearance of 3 bullock teams blocked their path and took them by surprise. The drivers of the drays were nowhere to be seen, leaving the gold escort to navigate around the unexpected obstacle. Fagan, with his characteristic authority, called out, "Make way for the Royal Mail," but to no avail. The path was blocked and they had no choice but to try and circumvent the drays. As they neared a massive boulder, an ominous sight met their eyes. From behind this boulder, men rose, their identities obscured by red comforters wrapped around their heads and the blackening on their faces. Clad in red shirts and armed with an array of rifles and revolvers, the sight was a chilling one. At Gardiner's call, the men let loose a volley of gunfire. The bullets rained down on the coach, splintering the timber frame and causing chaos. The frightened horses galloped off into the bush with the vehicle, and 2 police still trapped. The coach rolled over, colliding with boulders. With complete surprise, the police sergeant in charge, Condell, was hit 3 times. Trooper Senior Constable Moran was shot in 2 places, one of which struck his groin, and Trooper Constable Haviland was uninjured, fleeing into the bush, with driver Fagan and Trooper Constable Rafferty also unhurt. The robbers, shrieking in their adrenaline-charged victory, carried away the escort boxes filled with gold, cash, as well as 2 rifles and one of the coach horses. Their loot was indeed hefty, consisting of 2,700 ounces of gold, amounting to well over $7 million in today's value, and £3,700 in Oriental banknotes, an equivalent of $310,000 in today's terms. The hold-up is considered to be one of the largest gold robberies in Australian history. George Burgess was only 13 years old at the time, and he acted as an assistant to Dick Bloomfield, the person in charge of the family wagon. In his role as billy boiler, someone who made tea, Burgess had a unique perspective on the event. He recounted how Frank Gardiner commandeered the drays. According to Burgess, Gardiner was polite, articulate and commanding. His authoritative demeanour quickly established control over the situation. His charisma and assertiveness overrode any objections, making it clear he was in charge. Despite the inherently criminal nature of the act, Burgess's account paints Gardiner as something of a gentleman bandit. This perspective aligns with other accounts of Gardiner's behaviour, suggesting a man who relied on charm and wit as much as force to achieve his goals. While such accounts certainly do not excuse his actions, they do provide a more nuanced picture of this infamous figure. Ultimately, these first-hand accounts reveal a man who's not just a ruthless bushranger, but a master manipulator, able to control situations and people with his charisma and intelligence. Despite the fear and uncertainty his presence undoubtedly caused, he left a lasting impression on those he encountered. Sir Frederick Pottinger, still on the chase, mustered his black trackers, including Billy Dargan, and en route to Eugowra, gathered settlers, some 20 in number, and made for the scene of the action, arriving early on the Monday morning. Taking command of the situation, Pottinger immediately launched an intensive manhunt to bring the culprits to justice. Having escaped the police pursuit, Gardiner led his men to Wego Hill, 60-odd miles distant, instructing their guide Daniel Charters to go as crooked as you can so as to bother the trackers. It was here that the gang regrouped after their audacious robbery, dividing their spoils under the safety of the hill's summit. Once the proceeds had been distributed into 8 equal shares, Ben Hall, Jack O'Malley, Mans and Bode took their leave. John Gilbert remained at the camp with his £22 of gold and £460 in notes safely tucked away in his saddlebag. Gardiner, Fordyce and Charters moved their gold into one of the bags hanging from the pack horse taken from the coach. However, additional storage was needed, and Charters was supposedly sent to Hall's home for extra saddlebags. Upon reaching Hall's yard, Charters found himself unexpectedly confronted by Sergeant Sanderson. Reacting swiftly, Charters bolted back to the hill, alarmed the others with cries, "Look out, the traps are upon us." In the ensuing panic, Gardiner, accompanied by Charters and Johnny Walsh, grabbed the pack horse reins and fled towards the dense Wedden Mountains. Gilbert hastily mounted his horse, abandoning his partner and leader, an act that would spell the end of their camaraderie. For the first time in his criminal escapades, Gardiner succumbed to panic, making a grave error in his haste. With the relentless police pursuit in mind, he felt the weight of the pack horse was hampering their escape. In a moment of extreme pressure, Gardiner made the fateful decision to abandon the reins of the pack horse, leaving his share, along with those of Charters and Fordyce, on the horse's back. For Charters and Fordyce, their involvement in the audacious gold heist turned out to be a fruitless endeavour. When the authorities recovered the pack horse and the gold it carried, Gardiner only offered Charters a paltry £50 as compensation. Fordyce, on the other hand, received nothing. In Gardiner's eyes, Fordyce's failure to discharge his weapon during the ambush of the gold coach and his drunken state rendered him undeserving of any share in the loot. What happened to the remaining gold is still subject of much speculation. Treasure hunters still visit the area. 5 years after the robbery, Fogg received a visit from an Irishman bearing a letter from Gardiner. Enclosed was a rough map of the locality in which the Eugowra gold was hidden in a cave with other loot. For 12 months they searched without success, and the Irishman returned to America. Until he became too old to climb Mary's Mount, Fogg maintained the search for the gold hoard, but in vain. Somewhere in one of those hundreds of caves haunted by rock wallabies, a fortune lies hidden. The dramatic escort robbery turned out to be Gardiner's final act of bushranging. In the aftermath of the robbery, Frank Gardiner found himself with an empty pocket despite the daring undertaking. With no share of the stolen bounty and the authorities on his tail, Gardiner, reputed for his elusive ways, promptly disappeared from New South Wales. For weeks his whereabouts were subject of rampant speculation. Some reports suggested he might have found refuge in Victoria, possibly in the bustling port city of Portland. Others insisted that South Australia was the more likely destination for the infamous bushranger. However, during this period of relative quiet, some stories insinuated that Gardiner was laying low in Ballarat, biding his time until the heat subsided. The facts were elusive, much like Gardiner himself, a man known for his adeptness at disappearing into the shadows when the situation demanded it. Then, after weeks of being off the radar, Gardiner resurfaced. His return was not in any of the speculated locales, but back at Wego at the home of Kitty Brown. His return was as unexpected as his departure, adding another layer to the mystique of the notorious bushranger. On Saturday, 9th of August 1862, it marked a potentially pivotal moment for Inspector Pottinger. Equipped with his insider information, he embarked on a covert mission from Forbes at dusk, bypassing the main road to maintain discretion. He arrived around 10 o'clock at night after a gruelling 30-mile trek through the bush. He set up camp about 2 miles from Kitty Brown's home, and Pottinger and Inspector Saunderson moved on foot to survey the area, bristling with anticipation. Kitty Brown's house stood isolated, a lone structure in a small open space surrounded by thick scrub near the main Wego homestead. Pottinger was convinced that the Darkie would be arriving soon, drawn to Kitty by their clandestine romance. His men were positioned strategically, their nerves alight with tension as they waited in the dark. And then, like a spectre under the cloak of midnight, Gardiner appeared. Casually riding his white charger towards Kitty's home, he remained oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. The tension skyrocketed as Kitty stepped outside to gather some wood and then retreated back into her home. Pottinger waited with bated breath, the adrenaline coiling tight within him. As Gardiner drew near, Pottinger sprang from his hiding spot, shouted, "Stand in the Queen's name." He aimed his carbine at the unsuspecting bushranger and pulled the trigger. Startled, Gardiner let out a shriek, but a malfunction in Pottinger's carbine spared him from harm. Seizing the opportunity, Gardiner took off, escaping the clutches of Pottinger and his 8 strategically placed troopers, 2 of whom also fired and missed as the bushranger disappeared into the night. Gardiner thrust his horse into the surrounding scrubland. Once they reached a distance of about 500 yards from the scene of the encounter, Gardiner reined in his horse, pausing to steady his nerves and contemplate his next move. The Lachlan Miner on the 12th of August 1862 said, "It seems that the black trackers found in the morning that Gardiner had dismounted about 500 yards away and actually seated himself down at the foot of a tree." In the closing months of 1862, it was widely rumoured that Francis Christie, using the alias James Christie, secretly married Kitty Brown. This was confirmed by Kitty herself. While the rest of the gold robbers stayed in the district and were rounded up and caught, Gardiner opted to flee with Kitty. After the robbery, there was speculation that they went to Portland in Victoria, South Australia, Ballarat. However, while under oath, Kitty said they went to the Edward River, northeast of Swan Hill in Victoria. In March or April 1863, they headed to Queensland. They passed through Rockhampton and en route encountered another couple who were heading in the same direction. The Craigs had been stranded. Their dray was stuck in mud on the road outside Rockhampton near Yamba. They were returning to Apis Creek with their 6-month-old baby, Ellen Louisa, and here Gardiner, friendly and helpful, lent a hand and introduced himself as James Christie. During their chance encounter, Gardiner intimated to Craig his intended destination was Connors Range, situated approximately 40 miles south of Mackay. However, Craig divulged that he himself was on the verge of completing construction on a hotel conveniently situated a much shorter distance away at Apis Creek. This sparked an interest in Gardiner, who saw a potential opportunity closer than when he initially planned. In partnership with Craig, they established a multifaceted business enterprise encompassing a hotel, a general store and a butcher's shop, all side by side. The Apis Creek Hotel, crafted with wooden slabs with a roof made from the bark of local white gum-topped box and ironbark trees, was a rustic yet charming establishment. Once the new venture was set up, Frank and Kitty oversaw the daily operations of the general store and the butcher's shop, while Archibald Craig and his wife Maria managed the hotel. Frank Gardiner, now known as James Christie, quickly built a reputation as a respectable, polite and helpful citizen. His demeanour was such that he soon became a favourite amongst the locals, who deemed him trustworthy. Kitty, too, was appreciated by locals and travellers alike for her gracious hospitality when assisting the miners. Gardiner maintained a low profile during this time at Apis Creek. Despite handling substantial amounts of gold, he did not draw attention to himself. His physical appearance had changed too. He'd gained weight and grown a full beard and whiskers, which helped mask his facial features. In January 1864, a reporter for the Geelong Advertiser made a sensational claim that Gardiner was in Queensland. Upon information accumulated by New South Wales Police, Detective Daniel McGlone, Constables James Pye and Wells were dispatched to Queensland to substantiate the current intelligence regarding Gardiner's presence at Rockhampton or its surroundings in order to nab the most wanted man in the empire. In February 1864, Gardiner was dragged out of the pub into the street and forcefully apprehended. He was taken back to New South Wales despite the police having not received permission to go outside their jurisdiction. The account from one of the policemen. When we crossed Apis Creek, we were approaching the store. We saw two men splitting shingles about 50 yards from the store on the opposite side of the road, and Gardiner standing talking to them. Pye, in a low tone of voice, said to me, "Look out, let us cut him off the store," for Gardiner was walking towards the store to meet us. Pye led the pack horse close to the store door, and I, seeing a kangaroo dog lying on the ground on Gardiner's path to the store, said good morning, and pointing to the dog added, "That's a fine dog," at the same time calling Pye's attention to it. That was the sign for arrest. Gardiner was then about 5 yards from the store door. Pye stepped back towards him. I instantly put my revolver in Gardiner's face, calling upon him to stand, upon which he was taken so much by surprise that he stepped back towards Pye, who quickly threw his arm around Gardiner's neck and put his knee into his back, and in a moment the ex-bushranger was on his back. I then snapped the handcuffs onto him and tied his legs with a piece of rope that I'd prepared with a loose shirt. Lieutenant Brown, with his black police, then appeared on the scene, and the latter were off their horses instantly and surrounded the place to prevent escape. After Gardiner had sat up, he asked for a drink of water and begged to have the handcuffs taken off. This being refused, he commenced pleading his innocence to the charges he was arrested upon. However, it was arranged to remove him to Mr. McKellar's station. I had 4 black police to assist in guarding him that night until Lieutenant Brown, McGlone and Pye returned from the store in the hotel after taking an inventory of all property, gold and money that was found on the premises. The next day he was escorted to Yamba and thence to Rockhampton. Mrs. Brown accompanied the escort and showed great courage in swimming her horse over the Yamba River, which was flooded at that time. She followed us to Rockhampton, to Brisbane and then to Sydney, trying at every opportunity to bribe me and others with money to get Gardiner's liberty before reaching Sydney. She nearly succeeded in securing his escape at Brisbane, owing to McGlone's blunder in not taking Gardiner direct to Sydney from Rockhampton, from which town he was remanded. At 2 o'clock, amid driving rain, Gardiner, Craig and Kitty were placed in the court as a large crowd, soon gratified by their appearance, jostled for advantage. Catherine Christie, formerly Mrs. Brown, was charged with assisting and concealing the prisoner, Francis Christie, alias Gardiner. At the Rockhampton lockup, she gave her maiden name as Catherine Walsh. Under examination by the prosecutor, Mr. Dick, Catherine Brown detailed her trip to Queensland, stating, "I am Francis Christie's wife. I was lawfully married to him." She said they were secretly married before departing Weo, where Frank no doubt used his middle name of James. Documents produced at the time of his arrest and at the preliminary trial in February 1864 proved that he was legally and secretly married under the assumed name of James Christie. It was sometime in June last that I came to Queensland. I came overland in the company with my husband. We came from New South Wales direct to Apis Creek. Mr. Craig conducted the business of the inn and my husband that of the store, and they assisted each other. By the bench. She knew no charge against her in Sydney, nor of any warrant being issued for her apprehension. He did not arrest her at Opus Creek, but she accompanied Gardiner and the other prisoner down to Rockhampton and arrested her that morning. The bench decided to discharge the prisoner from custody. From Rockhampton, Gardiner was transported to Brisbane by steamer and then on to Sydney and to Darlinghurst Jail. As Gardiner was held in Darlinghurst Jail, Kitty would make every effort to hinder McGlone and even attempted to procure a horse as an avenue for escape. Gardiner faced trial over the robbery of the two storekeepers, Everett Horsington and Henry Hewitt. On the 5th of July, in a shock move, pleaded guilty to the two charges. 15 years hard labour for whinging two constables, 10 years for the robbery from Horsington and 7 years for the robbery from Hewitt. He received a total of 32 years. The conclusion of Gardiner's trial and the announcement of his sentence was marked by a rather curious development. His most notable criminal act, the audacious Eugowra gold escort robbery of 1862, was conspicuously overlooked throughout the proceedings. Gardiner was never convicted or held accountable for those events on June the 15th, 1862. Sydney was engulfed by a wave of public indignation as journalists began to scrutinise the surprising outcome of the first trial. The decision by the 12 jurors to find Gardiner not guilty was met with widespread disbelief and discontent. Gardiner, a man known for his nefarious deeds, had managed to evade the gallows, which to many represented a grave failure of the justice system. Even as Gardiner languished behind bars for the next 32 years, the impact of his criminal legacy lingered, haunting the quiet settlers of the Forbes, Bathurst and Goulburn districts. His former cohorts, Hall, Gilbert, Dunleavy, Mount and the recent recruit Dunn, continued to wreak havoc on these communities, their audacious exploits escalating to more brazen raids, robberies, arson, murder and even kidnapping. Despite the terror spread by former gang members, Gardiner found himself the object of an active and sympathetic group of admirers and hero worshippers. Chief amongst them were his three devoted sisters, Robina, Archina and Charlotte, who for the next 8 years waged a relentless campaign for his release. They petitioned the influential, pursued judges, doctors, parliamentarians and common citizens, painting a romantic picture of Gardiner. His hidden stash of ill-gotten wealth from past robberies also came in handy, fueling the agitation for his freedom through the distribution of handbills and other forms of public persuasion. As the years trickled by, the harsh prison guards, initially indifferent to Gardiner, grew more tolerant and even friendly. They revelled in the reflected fame derived by their association. Gardiner's life at Darlinghurst Jail, much like his previous tenure at Cockatoo Island, fell into a rhythm of rigid routine. The notorious bushranger, once feared and respected, was now just another convict, his days marked by a monotonous passage of time. Following Frank's sentencing in 1864, Kitty was left shattered by the magnitude of her beloved's punishment. However, her spirit remained unbroken. She clung to the belief that she would find a way to reunite with him. In late 1864, she began to devise a plan that would bring them back together. But as is often the case, greed became an essential component of her scheme, leading Catherine to corrupt a prison warden to aid their escape. As Catherine schemed and plotted, keeping these plans confidential proved to be an almost insurmountable task. In no time, whispers of an escape attempt began to circulate within the prison walls. Meanwhile, the authorities maintained a close watch on Frank. In response, Frank resorted to his old trick, feigning illness once again. Playing on his supposed heart condition, he managed to secure admission into the prison hospital. Regrettably for Kitty and Frank, their secret plan was discovered by another prisoner who'd managed to piece together the details. Fearing repercussions, the inmate chose self-preservation over loyalty, and the canaries sang, blowing their whistle, exposing the corrupt guard in the process. Thus, the seeds of their hopeful plan were sown and just as quickly uprooted. In 1867, 3 years after his 32-year sentence, Gardiner's unique talents began to draw attention. Various prison employees involved in the prison's various income-generating activities noticed Gardiner's particular skills. They observed his prowess in calligraphy, bookbinding, and core mat-making, all of which significantly contributed to the prison's financial sustainability. During his incarceration, he managed to maintain ties with his family. These bonds manifested particularly during celebratory occasions such as birthdays and Christmas. On these occasions, Frank would receive thoughtful parcels from his sisters, filled with life's necessities, especially food items. By May 1865, all of Gardiner's initial companions, including John O'Malley, who died in 1863 and was a central figure in Gardiner's bushranging exploits, had met their untimely ends. Ben Hall had been ruthlessly gunned down in a bush camp by a trigger-happy firing squad of the New South Wales Police. John Gilbert was fatally shot while attempting to flee an ambush at Bennelong, and Mickey Burke was also shot dead in 1863. During his imprisonment, Gardiner's infamous past drew many high-profile visitors to his cell, among them Sir Henry Parkes, a key figure in Australia's Federation, who was deeply interested in the Gardiner case. Parkes visited the incarcerated bushranger several times in Darlinghurst Jail and was markedly impressed by Gardiner's character and demeanour. In 1868, a deeply tragic event took place. Kitty, the woman that Frank loved, took her own life. It was around this time that two new tattoos made their appearance on Gardiner's arms: an image of a cupid on his right upper arm and a heart surrounded by a wreath of roses on his left upper arm. It's likely these tattoos were a poignant tribute to his beloved Kitty, perhaps the only visible testament to the depth of his grief over her loss. Following Kitty's death, there were reports that Gardiner seemed to age significantly, an indication of the emotional turmoil that the tragedy had taken on him. Nevertheless, the time continued its relentless march, and Gardiner's sisters remained unwavering in their efforts to secure his release. Their tireless advocacy kept hope alive within the walls of Darlinghurst Jail. In 1872, a petition was organised by Gardiner's sisters seeking his early release. William B. Daly had defended Gardiner and prepared for presentation to the newly appointed Governor of New South Wales, Sir Hercules Robinson. The Governor, as representative of the English sovereign, had the power to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy for felony cases not subject to the death penalty. By the time it reached the Governor in September 1872, it had attracted the signatures of a number of prominent public men, including members of Parliament and the former Colonel Secretary William Forster. The country found itself divided over the question of Gardiner's release. Regardless of the fervour on both sides of the debate, the Governor decided to exercise his prerogative and discretionary powers. The division on the vote for Gardiner's release was incredibly tight, with an equal tally of 26 votes for and against the proposal. The final decision fell to the Speaker, the Honorary William Munning Arnold, who cast his vote in favour of the Governor's decision for release. It was decided that Gardiner had been harshly sentenced. The condition was that he had to serve 10 years incarceration, his conduct in prison had to remain good, and he had to leave the country upon release and become an exile to the Australian colonies and New Zealand, and he was forbidden from returning until his full sentence expired, which would have been 22 years later, in 1896, in which Gardiner would have been 67 years old. In 1874 he was released, and on the 27th of July 1874 Gardiner embarked for Hong Kong. The vessel chosen to ferry Gardiner away from Australia was the Charlotte Andrews, a coal bark operating between China and Newcastle. His transfer from Sydney to Newcastle was executed on the Lady Young, a paddle steamer owned by William Hill. A harrowing journey lay ahead. While en route to Shanghai, the Charlotte Andrews carrying Gardiner encountered a fierce typhoon, and on September the 23rd, 1874, the ship made anchor on Stonecutters Island, Hong Kong. The extreme weather dismasted the vessel and staved in its stern. His stay in Hong Kong was brief. The Charlotte Andrews was incapacitated and he needed to find another means to continue his journey. He then boarded the Great Republic, a vessel owned by a San Francisco-based Pacific Steamship Company. The journey took him via Yokohama, Japan, and ultimately he arrived in California on the 18th of December 1874. By 1875, Frank Gardiner was granted permission to settle in San Francisco. The reports revealed that Gardiner had established a saloon on San Francisco's infamous Barbary Coast. The annual directory of the city and county of San Francisco in the years 1876 to 1878 confirmed that Frank Gardiner was the proprietor of a saloon located at 1031 Kearney Street. The saloon, named the Starlight, had an unsavoury reputation. During 1878 in San Francisco, as Frank entertained patrons at his Barbary Coast saloon, he was visited by none other than the Australian cricket team, returning from England after a tour. Stopping over in San Francisco, the team played a California side from two local cricket clubs. One of the visitors from the Australian team was Fred Spofforth, considered one of the best bowlers ever to play. The team sailed from San Francisco on the 28th of October in the SS City of New York, arriving in Sydney on the 25th of November 1878. And he reported, Frank Gardiner, the notorious New South Wales bushranger, is keeping the Twilight Hotel San Francisco and doing a roaring trade. He has grown stout. According to these accounts, Gardiner was not just scraping by as a sole proprietor and bartender of his saloon, but he was able to afford hiring staff to assist in its operation. In around 1879, Gardiner sold off his Kearney Street saloon for a new establishment, possibly called the Twilight Star. By the 1880s, Gardiner appeared no longer registered as a saloon keeper nor a resident of Barbary Coast. Gardiner had once again dropped off the map and evaporated. But had he died? Well, Frank Gardiner's yearning to return to Australia was far from a secret. His persistent inquiries with steamer captains regarding passage home were always met with firm refusal, but this didn't deter him. His frequent interrogations of Australians arriving at the port about the current state of affairs back home were telltale signs of his homesickness. Above all, his sisters, his last tangible connection to his homeland, were likely never far from his thoughts, adding a melancholic undertone to his life in San Francisco. As the years rolled by into the new century, around 1910, Frank Gardiner's past was recalled, notably his time as a hotelier. Interestingly, the mention of Gardiner made no reference to his passing, which one might have expected to feature in a memoriam. Given the circumstances, the absence of such information was intriguing. The fact that Gardiner was referred to as a former resident could suggest that he was indeed alive and had returned to Australia successfully. This omission raised questions about Gardiner's fate and led to further credence to the theory that he might have made his way back into Australia undetected. It was reported that Gardiner had overextended credit to his clientele and couldn't pay his bills. The most likely scenario is that he turned to alcoholism, and some say that he died in a poorhouse in San Francisco in 1892, and that they believe he was buried in a pauper's grave near the Legion of Honor Park in San Francisco. The circumstances of his death are not known with any degree of certainty, and the lack of evidence of his burial is due in large part to the destruction caused in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Tales of him being shot dead, succumbing to injuries from barroom brawls, or leading a desolate life as a drunkard filled the gossip mill. Allegations of his involvement in stagecoach robberies, marrying a wealthy woman and having 2 sons with her were other rumours. Yet another rumour was that he died in Colorado in 1903. None of these have been proven. It is entirely possible that Francis Christie, known for his talent for disguise, including posing as a clergyman, and the financial stability and social standing of his loyal sisters, Archina, Charlotte and Robina, that he was possibly legally allowed to return freely by 1896 when he was 67, and it is plausible that unlike his past mistakes at Apis Creek, he returned to Australia to live out the rest of his days under the care of his sisters and likely adopting one of his many aliases. Whether he was basking under the Californian sun, taking refuge in the Australian outback, remains a topic of endless debate. When his brother Charles fell ill and died in 1885, rumours suggested that Frank might have travelled through New Zealand and then to Victoria. Others speculated that he could have made a pilgrimage to Twapi in New Zealand to visit Kitty's grave. So in the end, Francis Christie was quite a mystery right up until his death. There are a lot of areas of his life that can't be fully accounted for or be backed up by documentation. In the bonus episode, I'm going to cover Frank Gardiner's family, including Kitty. It's very interesting to see how his sisters and brother carried on with their lives. So tune into the bonus episode. It's via subscription. It's only $5 a month to subscribe to Family History Mysteries, and you can access this bonus episode on Frank Gardiner there.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.